Hi, and welcome back. Since the Tour Divide for 2025 is quickly approaching, I thought that I would take a little break from my adventure videos and talk a little bit about some of the logistics, because I know that when I was looking into doing the Tour Divide, I found some good resources, but it was a little hard for me to get a comprehensive idea of what to expect. So of course you can watch a lot of YouTube videos of people doing their adventure, but not a lot of people talk as much about the ins and outs of planning or costs or things like that. So hopefully this will be helpful to you, but I'm going to go over all of that stuff. Before I start, I just want to say, obviously this is not all encompassing, and this was just my experience, and I'm not complaining about the way it was done or anything or making judgment on that. This is just the things that I observed, and I hope that they will be helpful to you. But if you do have any questions, please do leave those in the comments, and I will answer them as fast as possible so that you can get set planning your race. If you are doing this in 2025, good luck to you. I wish you all the best, and you're gonna have a great time. What I'll do first is I'll go over some of the information about transportation to and from the race, about the planning I did before the race, and then kind of how it worked as far as leading up to the race, as far as like currently right now, the couple of weeks before the race starts, how that works, or how that worked for me at least. And then I'll go over the amenities, the accommodation, and the costs of doing it. And at the very end, I'll talk about some of the pros and cons and things that I thought that I was really happy to have, for instance, or that I could have done without. I'll also link anything that has a information link in the description below, so hopefully that will help you with your planning. If you're new here, my name is Kyria, and last year I quit my job so that I could pursue a life of full-time travel and adventure, and I started off last year by riding my bike across the US and Canada, as well as doing the Tour Divide race. I'm currently traveling internationally and having a great time doing that, but I do miss my bike, so I hope to get back on the bike pretty soon. All right, I'll talk first about how I got to the start. As I said, I rode my bike across the US and Canada, so I actually rode my bike from California, but most people probably aren't going to do that. So I think a lot of people fly into the Calgary airport, and from there you can take the Highway 1A, which goes through Cochrane and then goes through Canmore and then goes into Banff. From Canmore to Banff, there is a legacy trail, bike trail, which is really pretty. The Highway 1A, for me, was not the most pleasant thing. I had a horrible headwind, and it's a pretty narrow road. It's just a 2-lane road with not really much of a shoulder. And there were a lot of bigger trucks and cars that I thought there would be, like 18-wheelers and stuff. So that I thought was going to be a tiny little frontage road next to the Trans-Canada Highway, but it was a pretty well-traveled road. So it was more busy than I thought it was going to be, but that is a way that you can get there. It wasn't that bad. It was just a little bit heavier traffic than I had expected looking at it on the map. The other thing that I was going to do is I was going to ride from Fernie over Elk Pass to get to Banff, but I was there at the end of May and the pass still had too much snow on it to get past, so that's why I ended up going an alternate route. You can see that in my video. I did a video about Alberta, which I will link here, but otherwise it was just too heavy of snow, and I ended up going from Fernie on the Crow's Nest Highway to the Cowboy Trail to Cochrane, and then on the 1A to get to Canmore and subsequently Banff. There are definitely many different ways you could go, but it just really depends on how the weather is this year. I don't really know how bad the snow is for this year. I do know some people that rode from Montana later on, so right before the race, so more like in the first couple of weeks of June, and they did get through the pass, so it might be better in a week or two. Once the race is done, you have several ways of getting from the end at Antelope Wells back to either Tucson or Hachita or wherever, El Paso, and I know that in Hachita, there's a man named Jeff, and he actually has a place where you can sleep if that's going to be like your second to last night's stop, or he'll pick you up from the end and bring you back there, and you can sleep there that night. And I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe he also takes people to other bigger cities where there are airports. So maybe Tucson is one of them, or Albuquerque. I'm not 100% sure on that because I didn't use him. Who I ended up using was a company called Amigo Shuttle, and they will pick you up and take you to any of those places as well, but El Paso is one of them. And my story is that I was going to take the Amtrak from the finish line or from wherever I could get it to Chicago. And I thought that I could get on the Amtrak with my bike. There are 2 smaller stations in New Mexico that aren't that far from the finish. My plan had been to just ride to one of them get on the Amtrak, go to Chicago. But both of them do not allow checked luggage, and your bike is considered checked luggage in that case. So you cannot check your bike or bring your bike on the train at those stations. You can only get your person on the train at those stations. So in the end, I had to go to El Paso to be able to check my bike, to be able to go to Chicago with my bike. And that was no problem. I actually didn't have to box it up or anything. I just could wheel it on. I had to take the bags off, but you can just wheel it right onto the train. I also was traveling at the end with somebody else, and they were going to Houston, and they also could bring their bike on the train, even though our two lines diverged, and we ended up going to two different places in the end. But whether you're going to Houston or to Chicago, you go through San Antonio, and then the train split off, and in either case, we could both bring our bikes without having to box them up. The ride from Amigo cost $500 for two people, so it was kind of expensive, but that's just what it was. I did not feel like riding my bike anymore, so it was well worth it. So what was the weather like? Well, it varied, and you've probably watched a lot of Tour Divide videos, and you can see that in the various years it varies. I think in 2022 or 23, don't quote me, a bunch of people were airlifted out near Fernie because a big snowstorm came up. So definitely you may encounter snow or rain, at least, at the very least. And then by the time I got to Helena, it was 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So it varies a lot, and you need to be prepared for all of it. One tip I have definitely is that you should have waterproof stuff. So for me, I have done a lot of backpacking, and I've gone through a lot of rainstorms, and I've tried a lot of quote unquote waterproof gloves and waterproof clothing and whatnot. And a lot of it just isn't that great. So a good quality waterproof item is well worth it. And for the gloves, the best ones that I've found are actually the ugliest ones, and I will link them in the description below. But they're blue rubber gloves, maybe we'll put something over my face here, that I think are like for people working on power lines or something. I mean, they're like workers' gloves, and they don't cost that much money, and they have been great. They keep my hands warm. They keep my hands completely dry. But if you don't want to buy these ugly gloves, you can just get a pair of dishwashing gloves. Just make sure you get extra large ones and stick them over your regular gloves, and that will be a lifesaver. I also, when I was in Fernie, because this is when it was raining and snowing and cold, and a lot of people were buying plastic bags to put on their feet, plastic bags and dishwashing gloves to put on their hands, puffy jackets. I mean, people were buying all kinds of stuff. And so just make sure you're prepared for anything. I'm not saying you need to bring like a lot of stuff, but just a few plastic bags that you could put over your feet in a pinch and some dishwashing gloves may save the day for you. As far as the heat goes, I know this might not be practical, but when I left Helena, it was super hot, and I bought grapes, and they were cold from the fridge that I had in my hotel room. And a cold grape when you're really, really hot is like excellent, and I shared them, and I made a lot of friends. Sometimes a little bit of mental happiness is worth carrying something that may weigh a little bit more than you want to carry. Or you just eat them fast. All right, let's talk about planning. So I am a planner, and so this was something that kind of not frustrated me, but was a little bit harder for me to understand is, I read through all the stuff, and you were supposed to submit a letter of intent. So I submitted a letter of intent in the end of January or beginning of February, and I heard nothing back. And I'm used to getting some sort of confirmation, at least, even if there's no action taken. So that was a little, not nerve-wracking, but I just wanted to have confirmation that I was on the list. And I couldn't even find a list, and I didn't really know where to look. And so that kind of was a little bit weird for me. And I didn't hear anything back. And at the end of May, I finally started digging a little bit more. And what I found out is that on the Facebook page, which I had joined the Facebook page, and I will link that below. But on the Facebook page is a place where you can fill out a Google form. And once you fill out the Google form, your information is on there, and then you will be updated if there's any new information. However, even after I filled out the form, I kind of thought I was going to get new information, and it was a little while before I got any information even then. So it's not something that you're going to get constantly updated that things are happening or not happening. It's just like at the very end, you get a couple of emails and then you start racing. So if you're someone who likes to plan ahead or be confirmed ahead of time, that might be a little bit harder to handle, but it does happen. It just is not in a super timely manner. Also, as far as the Facebook group goes and the Google Docs link, that might have been there the whole time and I just didn't know where to find it. Maybe if you know, you can comment below and help other people, but I finally found it by asking people in the Facebook group where to find it. And in the end, it was on the Facebook group. And so I probably was just, if it was a snake, it would have bitten me or whatever. But anyway, hopefully that's helpful. As far as communication, I finally got an email back regarding confirmation of my letter of intent on June 6th, which was 8 days before the race start. Some other communication I received is from bikepacking.com asking for submission of your rig if you want to submit your rig. And that was a few weeks before the race started. A notification about 7 days before the race started that you need to sign up for track leaders. A notification about 7 days before the race started that the course had been updated and where to find it. About 2 days before the race started, I got an email from Crazy Larry talking about his pre-race briefing, which is the night before the race. And then the wave starts were updated or announced about 12 hours before my race start time. So like I said, it's not like a normal official race where you sign up and you have all the information in one place. You just kind of have to wait for it to come or find it on the Facebook group. But that's kind of the timeline of how that all worked out. As far as route info, again, since I had no information, I wasn't really sure if we were going to be provided with anything or we were just supposed to find it ourselves or how that worked. So I got Sarah Swallow's information from her 2023 Tour Divide and downloaded that. She also had a really great sheet where she talks about all the towns and what's available in those towns. So she had that on like a Word document. I took that, I made it into a table so I could see like how far everything was apart and what amenities they had. And I printed that out and then also had it as a PDF on my phone. I also find a really good PDF, which was a little bit outdated from 2019, which had all the POIs and mileages and amenities in every town. So whereas Sarah Swallows only has information of the fact that there is a bank or is a bike shop or is a restaurant, this PDF had names and phone numbers and things like that. So that was very helpful as well. Of course, little did I know they were going to change the route so that information was going to be obsolete as far as the mileages in some cases because some things were taken out or added or whatever. But it was still very helpful to have an idea of how far things were going to be or what amenities were going to be available or whether or not there was going to be a bike shop. That was an important one. Or water, for instance. So they were still very helpful even though the route ended up being changed. I also downloaded Sarah Swallow's GPX tracks, and again, those changed, but because I hadn't received any information, by a couple of weeks before the race, I wanted to have the stuff on my bike computer and everything, so I downloaded those and put them on my bike computer, and in the end had to download the new track and put it on my bike computer, but that's okay. So like I said, we got a notification that the new GPX track was available, and that's on a website called Topo Fusion, and that was the whole track. So I actually was trying to figure out how to split it up because I'd never done that before, but luckily some lovely person on Ride with GPS had already split it up, and so I just downloaded those instead, and so I had my segments already for me and didn't have to do the work. So thank you, whoever you are. I really appreciate that because that would have taken me a little while and I was glad not to have to do it. So I downloaded the full route and then the segments all onto my bike computer and also onto Komoot, and then had those available offline. I also obviously had them on Ride with GPS as another backup if I needed that. As far as planning goes, I didn't really do any day-to-day planning or mile by mile planning. I really just looked at everything and saw what sections were longer or maybe had less amenities or no water or things like that. I just took note of those so that I could make sure to be prepared for them when the time came. But as far as like where I was going to stay or how far I was going to go, I did not do any of that ahead of time. So that's kind of the gist of my planning. A couple other people that I ended up talking to used the 1 of 7, which they really liked, and then another guy had the Adventure Cycling Association maps, which he really enjoyed as well. All right, let's talk about amenities. So you've probably heard the saying that we pack our fears, and I know that my fear is that I'm going to run out of food. So there were places to get food pretty much every day. Sometimes it was just a crappy little gas station, but still there was an availability of food. However, I still carried like a day's worth of emergency food just in case. I also carried a stove and a pot and coffee because to me, having a nice hot cup of coffee if you're having a bad day really makes a difference. So it's not just physically draining, it's also mentally draining. And so if there's something that pleases you, that makes you happy mentally, I think it's worth carrying sometimes. So for me, that was coffee and a stove. There were a couple of sections that were a little more scarce, so I'm going to go over a few of those now. The first one was from Wise River, Montana to Lima, Montana. and that section is 136 miles. Wise River is a pretty small town as well, so they do have a general store that you can get some things at, but it may be worth picking up more things when you're in Butte instead of waiting to get to Wise River. Once you get to Wise River, you're going to go through a area that is basically a scenic highway. It does have campgrounds, there's water, but there's not really any food until you get to a place called Elkhorn Hot Springs, which is off route. So you could stop at Elkhorn Hot Springs if you're in dire emergency, but otherwise the next place is Lima, and there's really nothing in between. There's one place that was on my list, which is called the Horse Prairie Stage Stop, and I was really hopeful that they were going to be open so I could get some dinner, but they were only open very limited days and very limited hours, and they were closed when I went through. They did have a hose outside, so I did use that to fill up water, but otherwise that section was very sparse. The next section, which everybody knows about, is the basin. So from Atlantic City to Wamsutter is 96 miles. And Atlantic City does have a couple places to eat and a little tiny store as well. But again, that's very minimal. So if you want more stuff, if you think you're going to take longer, then you would pick it up in Pinedale. If you can do the section from Atlantic City to Wamsutter in one day, it's 96 miles, but I would suggest it. And what I did was I got up very, very early, like 3 o'clock in the morning, and started off before it even got light because I was trying to avoid the heat and the headwinds. And I carried about 6 liters of water with me, and I drank all of it. Also, once you get to Wamsutter, there's not really a lot there. There's 2 gas stations. One is Love's, the other is called 19. And the Love's, of course, has ice cream, which is good. Got that right away. But the 19 has pizza, whole pizzas. And I got one of those and I ate the whole thing. There are a couple of restaurants, but they were actually closed when I got there. Another long section is from Cuba to Grants, New Mexico. This section is 120 miles long, and it's basically on pavement the whole way. So it does go fairly fast and can be done in one day if you want to, but there are only 2 places to stop along the way. They're both gas stations, and I stopped at both of them. And the second one, which is called Chaco, will allow you to camp there in their parking lot, but they do lock up the gate at night, so I can't remember what time that is. I think maybe 8 p.m. You would need to be there before that time because they basically lock you in. I think you can leave early. I don't really know how that works, to be honest, but that is an opportunity for camping in the middle. Otherwise, I actually ended up finding a local and sleeping in their yard. That section is a lot of Navajo land, so there's really not a lot of amenities or even houses. So be prepared for that, and no water except for the 2 gas stations. Also, that section for me was about 100 degrees, so it was very hot. I had a headwind, so it didn't go quite as fast as I had wanted it to. The next section is Pie Town to Silver City, New Mexico, which is about 123 miles. This section was surprisingly long and there was not a lot of water. You can get water and you can camp at the Beaver Head Ranger Station, which is about 97 miles from Pie Town. And that's what a lot of people do. They go from Pie Town to Beaver Head, and then they go from Beaver Head to Silver City. So that's an option. But it is the first section is a pretty lonely stretch, and for me it was very hot, and then the monsoons came up, and then there was like a lot of danger of thunder and lightning, and so it was a little bit scary, and then it rained, and the mud is very, very sticky. So once the mud got sticky, it was like basically not even worth trying to push through it, so I ended up camping in the middle of the 2 of them. After you get from Beaverhead, then you go on to do a section of single track on the CDT, and there's not a lot of water. Everything was pretty dry there, and I was a little nervous about the single track. I didn't know how long it was going to last or how bad it was going to be because the prior section of single track was very difficult. It was on an edge, plus a lot of hike-a-bike. The section of single track in this section is not as bad, but one person that I was riding with had a drop bar bike with no suspension, and he really did not like this single track section. He said he really would have wished to have flat bars and maybe a little suspension on this section of the trail. The other problem was not only was there not a lot of water, but I also got a flat tire and it got dark and there were a lot of mosquitoes. So this section for me was very rough. And before you get to Silver City, there's a really small town called Pinos Altos, I believe. And luckily they have a saloon called the Buckhorn, and they were just closing, but they did cook up some fries, and I had a beer and some fries and a lot of water, and I felt a lot better. And then basically to Silver City from there, it's essentially downhill on a paved road, which is great. However, this section also has a lot more climbing than I anticipated. I kind of was thinking, since we're nearing the end, it's all downhill from there, something like that. I don't know why. but it had a lot more uphills. In fact, the section from Pie Town to Silver City has about almost 12,000 feet of climbing. So let's talk about accommodation. Out of the 37 days that it ended up taking me, I stayed in a hotel 12 nights, and then the rest of the time I camped. I didn't book any accommodation ahead of time. I usually just, some places like in Lima, you just walk up to the motel and ask for a spot. And then sometimes if I had service, I would book something like Fernie, for instance. I didn't have very much service until I got to the highway, which was just outside of Fernie. So I booked that like literally a half an hour before I got to Fernie, maybe even not even. So luckily I got one of the last rooms too, because it was raining and it was muddy and it was cold. Okay, let's talk about the costs, and then I'll go into the pros and cons, and then we're almost wrapping this up. So I was on the route for a total of 37 days, and for accommodation, like I said, 12 nights, it cost about $1,100. So that's an average of about $91 per night. For dining out, I spent $542, which is about $15 a day, which actually isn't that bad. However, I did also spend $490 on groceries, so that's another $13.27. So altogether for food, that's about $28 a day. I did end up shipping myself an extra set of brake pads, so that cost $15. This doesn't include anything I bought before the race, like any maintenance I did, no cycling gear, nothing. I did buy some cycling gear and do a lot of bike maintenance along the route, and this cost me a total of $723. I'll go over what that included in a minute. And then for transportation, like I said, we had to get a ride at the end, plus I took the train afterward and I included that in my transportation as well. And that was $331. So altogether, I spent $3,200, which comes out to about $87 a day. A few things I wish I would have known beforehand, or wish I would have done beforehand, is I wish I would have set my bike up tubeless. I didn't have tubeless set up, and the bike I had would have required pretty much new wheels altogether in order to do tubeless. I mean, I could have amended my wheels, but I didn't get a lot of good reviews about doing that, and so I decided not to bother with it. I did end up having to patch my tube about 5 times, but I did just patch it, and I did keep getting new holes, but it held up the whole time otherwise. However, for peace of mind, especially at the end in New Mexico, there were a lot of cacti and other thorny plants. It would have been a lot better had I not had to worry about possibly getting a flat in that section. So I think for peace of mind, it would have been a lot better to have tubeless. Things that I'm glad I brought is I had a whole set of brake pads, and I changed those out, and I actually sent myself a new whole set of brake pads in Del Norte. And I'm really glad I had those, because when I was in Pinedale, I was going to see if the bike shop had them, and they did not have the kind that I needed. So I am really glad I brought those with me, because at that point I needed to change them really badly. Speaking of changing brake pads, I also did a bit of trail maintenance. In Fernie, I got a new chain, cassette, and shifter cables. And then in Pinedale, I ended up needing a new bottom bracket. And so because I was going to change my bottom bracket, I decided to switch out my cassette and ended up going from a 8x2 to a 1x12. So I actually changed my cassette, bottom bracket, crank, chain, derailleur, pedals. And I also got new handlebar grips and a new mount for my Garmin, which I had broken when I fell in Helena, or outside of Helena. And like I said, I changed my brake pads in Pinedale, but I did only need to change my brake pads that one time in the end. So best and worst, I would say Canada was probably the most beautiful, and that's probably because there was snow, but it was hard. But I really enjoyed Colorado, even though there were some of the tallest, highest climbs. A lot of times they were quite gradual, and you could just like pump up very continuously without having to hike a bike or anything like that. So those were my favorite. And then also the downhills were often very fun. Although some of the downhills, I'm not sure if this is correct. Maybe it was Lynx Pass. After you go through Brush Mountain Lodge and then you go up a big pass, that pass, I forget what it's called. That one, going up, you have to hike a bike, and then going down, almost you have to hike a bike because it is so rocky. So that one was hard. The worst part was New Mexico. Their roads are just crappy. A lot of the roads are very washboardy or thick gravel or very lumpy, very bumpy. And of course, if they get wet, then they're peanut butter mud. And also there were monsoons, there were impending like lightning and thunderstorms, or there was sometimes not a lot of water. It was hot. You're nearing the end and it's kind of like you're just ready to be done. And So I don't know. New Mexico had some beautiful areas and some really nice people and some cute little towns, but like that was probably my least favorite state. I'm so sorry. And just as a side note, I think if I was going to do this as a touring thing, I would do it northbound and do New Mexico first when it's cooler and there's less monsoons, and then get to Canada when it's warmer and less snow. That's probably what I would do. So I guess that brings me to what I learned along the way. I guess that's what I learned, is if I ever do this again, that's how I'll do it. But I also learned, and I've already said this, but a good set of rain gear is priceless. I have an Outdoor Research rain jacket and Outdoor Research pants. And sure, they're not the lightest or ultralight or the thinnest or whatever, but I've tried some of the thinner ones. And if you get wetted out, then it's not worth not carrying the weight if you're just going to be wet and cold and sometimes put your life in danger. It's not worth it. So I will swear by the Outdoor Research jacket and pants. And then also, like I said, the Workman's waterproof gloves have been a game changer for me. Like I said, I did a lot of hiking where I was just freezing cold at the end of the day in my tent, trying to warm up, shivering in my sleeping bag, and having warm hands just really makes things a lot better. Especially when you're riding a bike and your hands are like this and they get cold and they're the first line of defense. And so you have to keep those warm. Personally, I don't care as much about dry feet, but like I said, a lot of people bought bags for their feet and things like that. I also carried a collapsible 1.5 liter bag, like a plastic water bag, for extra water carries, and I'm really glad I had that. I didn't have to use it too much, but on the times I did have to use it, it was really nice to have. Like I said, I carried 6 liters when I crossed the basin. I also carried a silk liner for the inside of my sleeping bag. So even though my sleeping bag is a 10-degree Fahrenheit sleeping bag, the silk liner is supposed to add like 10 more degrees, and it didn't get that cold, but you know, that rating is like, you know, comfort or whatever. It's really nice to have an extra, and especially for Canada and the northern parts of Montana, I really was glad to have it. And then I'll repeat one more thing, but carrying my stove and having the hot cup of coffee really just started off the morning right. And sometimes even if you need a break in the middle of the day, it's nice to stop and have a coffee, and then you carry on a lot happier. So sometimes those little luxury items are worth it. Actually, before I go, I'll say, I don't know if you watch Alone, but they did an interview with some of the people from Alone. You know, you have to go out in the woods by yourself, and whoever lasts the longest wins. And you get 10 items that you get to bring with you. And most people will bring a knife or a fishing line or something like that. And this one person brought soap because they said that being clean made them mentally happier and they could last longer if they were mentally happier. And so I think that holds true for this as well. So on that note, let me know if you have any questions. If I've missed anything, feel free to leave a note in the comments if you think there's any information that you have that could be helpful to other people. And I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them. But thank you very much for watching, and good luck on the race if you're doing it, and happy trails.